I'm going to talk to you about what we've learned over the last couple of years teaching an autonomous driving company how to do DevOps. So I'm Andy. I'm an engineering manager at Five for the foundation group. So we basically look after all of the kind of platform teams for the developers. So at the moment, we're kind of infrastructure and IT operations teams. Five, who are we? So Five, we sort of believe in a world where transport will be safe, will be green and available to all, and where people can pursue their dreams without the need to drive. So we started 5 years ago building our own complete autonomous vehicle system, successfully tested that in London. We were part of the government-backed Streetwise trials, which were the most complex AV trials completed publicly in Europe, where we had our Mondios driving around bits of London, bits of Croydon. We began to solve some of the industry's biggest challenges. More recently, using this expertise, we've now developed a software as a service safety assurance platform for autonomous vehicle development. So you can choose scenarios, upload your car stack, and then run varied simulations and do tests against your performance and your compliance with things such as ALKS regulations and digital highway code and all that sort of stuff, and then refine and iterate quickly. So a research-driven organization. We've got lots of close collaborative links with academic groups. We've got our own in-house scientists and engineers, and we regularly publish academic papers and that sort of great stuff. So that's sort of who we are and who I am. So how it started a couple of years ago in Doxlon's 50th event, before mankind was cursed by the dreaded corona. I did a little talk on how we'd handled ramping up from a startup that was very much in the discovery and ideation phase into needing a place for our developers to run in a production environment. So they'd gone from sort of doing development on laptops and that sort of thing, and we needed to sort of now throw everything together so we could build out our data pipelines and that sort of thing. They needed to iterate fast. They needed to deploy services into the cloud. Back then, we had a small DevOps team, of which there were 5 of us. We were sort of the gatekeeper and holder of the arcane mysteries of the cloud. But there were sort of five, then 6 of us to look after 150 software engineers. So it was just never going to work. So what we did was we tried to do as much stuff as possible to sort of shift left the responsibility for people getting their workloads into the cloud environment and being able to integrate and to iterate quickly. We didn't want our team essentially to act as a blocker for any of that kind of stuff. So some of it worked really well, some of it didn't. We learned a hell of a lot of stuff though, and this is I guess a little story of what we did learn and what we didn't. So once upon a time, if anybody wanted to get any of their software hosted, they had to come to us. We would then spend potentially days writing pages and pages of Terraform code to push stuff into the cloud. It was very frustrating for the developers. It was very frustrating for us. We didn't get things through as fast as we possibly could. So we went out and we had some conversations with our customers. We went and sat with our product teams and tried to find out what was important for them. Tried to identify exactly what capabilities they would need inside their teams to be able to do what they did. And we found that they hadn't, there was a range from people who were very comfortable with fiddling with AWS and people who didn't even know what it was, and then everything in between. So we tried to push that engagement with an infrastructure guild, where we did fortnightly talks on various things to do with infrastructure, such as how things like how our networking works in Kubernetes, how we do things in Terraform, how we can, make things dry and all of that sort of stuff. And then for the more acute, specific infrastructure things that people needed sorting, we had a kind of buddy system. So each of my engineers was sort of assigned to a couple of those product teams. So if they had any problems, they could go straight to them. We also did a bunch of training and workshops and that sort of stuff. And we threw together as much as we possibly could into a kind of, I'll call it a self-service platform, but what it really is a kind of collection of sort of libraries of code, of Terraform, of examples, of things that people can just sort of pick and choose, throw together into a repository and get stuff deployed onto our clusters. And we wrote documentation, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pages of documentation. So that sounds a lot like a platform and a platform team, which is a bit of a buzzword at the moment in the industry. Lots of people talking about it. It's come up a lot in things like the State of DevOps report recently. Tech Radar have been on about it for a couple of years. So what is a platform and what is a platform team? So platform, Evan Bocker from Tech Radar says that it's a digital platform is a foundation of self-service APIs, tools, services, knowledge and support. We're arranged as a compelling internal product so that autonomous delivery teams can make use of the platform to deliver product features at a higher pace with reduced coordination. So the way I interpret that is we're there as a kind of accelerator for their work. We're there to take their work. We're there to give them a way to take their work and get it in front of their customer as quickly as possible and iterate on it as quickly as possible. So the interesting things here are the phrase compelling internal product and that sort of idea of self-service APIs and tools and that sort of thing. So that's what we tried to concentrate on. And then we started to think like a platform team. So there's a quote here from Matthew Skelton and Manuel Pei from the Team Topologies book, which if you haven't read, I suggest you do because it's really good, even if you don't agree with all of it. It's really interesting insight. But their thoughts are that the primary mode of interaction between what they call stream-aligned teams, so your product teams, those teams that have their work aligned to the value stream of your company, and platform teams, which are the teams that own that try and own the underlying infrastructure and the methods for which they do what they need to do, is they call that X as a service. So it's a producer-consumer relationship, very similar to how you might have it with your ISP, for example. So what you try and avoid in that particular situation is long-running periods of collaboration. Not that you don't collaborate or facilitate, but that you try and keep those down to discrete patches of time. And the reason for that is because you want to make sure that you're getting the skills into those stream-aligned teams to be able to run independently, because that unblocks them, that lets them iterate as quickly as possible, and it stops this dependency or backlog chaining problem where they need a thing, they ask us for the thing, we plan the thing into a sprint, we deliver the thing, they don't test it for 2 sprints, they come back, and then we go backwards and forwards, and it's a nightmare. So the idea is to sort of push that relationship so that we're building a service that they consume, essentially. The issue we have with this, as I've mentioned before, is that we just basically I love my ASCII art there, but we get pulled in all different directions. So people will request features or log bugs and tickets and that sort of thing, and that's fine. But the problem is that there's also, especially when teams are new and they're ramping up, there's this period where they're still learning about the platform, and actually the cognitive load on their team is then skewed to this kind of extraneous stuff that they're learning new skills, so they're not actually performing very well. So we found that we needed to spend more time with them, this so-called buddy work that we talked about. Now, that sort of collaborative and facilitative work is a very different discipline to that kind of iterative sprint work that we do, this planned work. It's a very different discipline. And what we found was that this buddy work over here was driving a kind of distraction kind of led environment. And it was frustrating for our customers because things weren't getting fixed as quickly as possible, and they felt a little bit lost. And it was frustrating for us because we felt like we couldn't get any further with the development of the platform. We couldn't make the platform any better because we were spending all of our time firefighting. And then we've got the third bit, which is this kind of support work, which is the acute stuff that's coming in, like the bug fixing stuff. Something's broken, or we have an incident where a particular service goes down. So we're getting pulled in sort of 3 or 4 different directions there. So we needed to do something about that. So what we did do, if you go back to the team topologies book, they have this concept of an enabling team. So an enabling team essentially, I mean, you can read the quote, I'm not going to read it out to you, but an enabling team essentially exists to kind of bridge and close up capability gaps. So they cut across all or a subset of your stream-aligned teams and work work deliberately and intentionally in a collaborative or facilitative manner for specific defined periods of time. And the plan there is for them to upskill other teams, or to solve a specific acute problem, or to onboard the team onto a new service or piece of technology or something like that. Basically, they want to make themselves redundant for a particular problem domain, right? So we set up our own an engineering enablement team that we called it. They're responsible for advocacy and adoption of the infrastructure platform, its features, disseminating good practice, knowledge and tooling, bridging of skills gaps, and taking the pressure off the infrastructure team. So the infrastructure team can then concentrate on that sprint work, on the development of the platform and on the improvements, and the enablement team can work on the sort of the developer advocacy part of things. So that replaced the buddy work, completely solved that problem. Or did it? And spoiler alert, it did not. So essentially, if we have a look at the team topology we've built, we've got our component teams here. They are consuming our developer platform essentially as a service. And then we've got our enabling team, which sort of sit across here, and then they will go in. One of those members will go in for a period of time with another team to help them fix a problem. It might be to get them to build a CD pipeline, or it might be for them to onboard them on a new bit of technology, like like a scheduling system or a message queue or something like that. And then we also sort of built out a discrete support role. So someone would be essentially on call every week to handle the incoming stuff, the incidents, the alerts, monitor the Slack channel, answer the questions, that sort of thing, because that's also very disruptive work, but we keep them sort of isolated for that. And no one really likes doing it, but actually what we found is over time, it's sort of found its own niche, and it's manageable now, and people can sort of do that work and then still sort of dip in and help out with the sprint work or pick up some tech tickets or something like that. So summary, we had the infrastructure guild to spread our interest and talk about new and exciting things. We had our enablement team to collaborate, advocate, close the skills gaps. We had amazing and comprehensive documentation for excellent reference and bootstrapping of developers. Everything was self-service, and we had a dedicated support channel. So that's where all the magic blog posts on Medium and Signal end. And everybody's happy, and it worked really well. Just like the Spotify squads and tribes model that disappeared about 3 weeks after it started. So actually, we all know the world doesn't work like this. And we ran into a bunch of problems, and we made a bunch of decisions that weren't necessarily correct at the right time. So now we're going to talk about that a little bit. Oh yeah, I've got a lovely little animation here to sort of bookmark the other one. So yeah, what I found when we were sort of when we were starting in this journey and starting to do the advocacy work and starting to build all of these things up, were lots of sort of blog posts and videos and articles talking about these things in very high, in very sort of stratospheric kind of detail, with no kind of specific detail about how any of these things were done and what works and what doesn't. So I'm going to try and share a bit of what we've learned anyway now. So how's it going? So premature optimization really was what we found. We shifted too much, too left, too early. We got the split wrong about where responsibilities lay in terms of infrastructure provisioning. We set up a bunch of repositories for the product teams with layered Terraform modules in. So we'd own the bottom layers that deployed stuff like real sort of scaffolding stuff like DNS and Kubernetes namespaces and security groups and networking and all of that sort of thing. And then we'd leave them with the higher layers inside that repository for them to put in their own resources. So things like databases, message queues, S3 buckets, all of those lovely things from the Amazon Suite shop. We built a bunch of boilerplate modules that they could just reference and pull in those things and then build their own service out of it. Some of the teams are absolutely fine with this. A couple of the teams grabbed this and really ran with it. They started to do things that we didn't even do. They started looking at things like TerraGrunt for ways of doing things programmatically. They were using things like Terraform workspaces and all of this great stuff. And then some teams were not interested whatsoever, would not look at it, would not touch it. We basically had to write it for them. And every time they wanted something changing, it was a big pain. And then sort of we had sort of everything in between essentially. I think for that it was kind of we aimed for the end result without thinking about how we would iterate to get there, I think. And part of that was naivety, and part of that was because we didn't have time to do anything better. So what we're doing at this point when we're throwing all of this stuff together as well is accruing a lot of technical debt. We're not having time necessarily to automate some of this stuff. So we're leaving behind a bunch of, for us anyway, a bunch of manual tasks. So when these things need to be updated, we're having to go in and manually update them. But I'll talk about that a little bit later. So what ended up happening with these repositories are a complete mess, basically. Every team had a slightly unique way of handling things. We left key decisions like how to arrange and manage the structure of the Terraform modules and that sort of thing to themselves. We had a bunch of standards in there. About things like labeling and naming and that sort of stuff. But in terms of how things like how the folder structure was in the module, so how you find bits of Terraform in the module, we didn't have. So when we came to help, or when we came to change something or fix something or update something, we found so many different points of fracture that every time we tried to do something, it'd break in so many unpredictable ways. What we tried to consciously allow teams to make decisions for themselves, to be as autonomous as possible. But actually what they really wanted was a framework or a standard to follow. And we should really have picked up on that, but we didn't. Then the next one really is around the documentation piece. So writing documentation for people external to your team is really hard. It's really, really, really difficult to do. I'll write a runbook or something that I think is completely comprehensive, but what it does do is it assumes a bunch of prior knowledge. It's impossible to do this. It's not impossible, but it's very, very difficult to do this from the point of view of someone else coming into reading it without knowing some of these concepts and that sort of thing. And you do this completely subconsciously. And even if your documentation was explained absolutely everything, and unless you're really diligent with cross-linking things, and you've got no assurance that someone will, for example, read a page about how to access Vault before they've, they might read that page before they've read the page on how to set up their authentication, and then they get stuck. So unless you're really diligent on making sure that you push people around the right route, the documentation is great, but it's not always great. It's not always easy to find what you need, because even if you've got the greatest search engine in the world, if a developer doesn't know what they're searching for, they're not going to find it. One solution is to write your documentation in a narrative format, which sort of takes your user through the journey. But that assumes your user's got a couple of hours to kill reading a novel about your Kubernetes cluster, which they don't have. So what we found was documentation is really, really great for reference, but it's really not great for new users. Unless, of course, you've got a technical writer or someone with those skills, but we didn't. And if your documentation isn't comprehensive or useful enough for their first encounter with them, and their first encounter with the documentation is a bad experience, the likelihood of them then going there first next time is very, very low, and that becomes frustrating. And we ended up getting very frustrated pointing people to the same links over and over again in Slack chats. And that makes everyone upset. It makes us upset. It makes them annoyed because it feels like you're fobbing them off. So be careful about that sort of thing. And it turns out that technical writing is a skill, and people do it for a living and stuff. Who knew? As I say, they're great for a reference, but they're only going to be complementary to some sort of training. But training is difficult. It takes time to set up. It takes time to do. We'll talk about that a little bit later on as well. Our enablement team, we also optimized prematurely with these as well. One of the things we wanted to avoid really early on with these guys was engagements with other teams just dragging on forever with no end, because this is one of the problems we had with our kind of buddy system. What I wanted to try and do was agree up front what the exit criteria were. So what we were trying to achieve, build a kind of outcome-based agreement between us and the other team. And this sort of worked. It works really well if there is a kind of a specific thing that someone wants to do, but it doesn't work very well if that outcome is a little bit more vague. And what's happened is the process, I think, has ended up a little bit too formal, and it scares people off. So yeah, and because of the nature of what the company's been through over the last 12 months anyway, we haven't necessarily had time to do the stuff that we want to do with them. So if you remember, we talked about the idea of they were sort of making themselves redundant. So they were going into the team, they were teaching the team something, and then leaving those capabilities behind. Now, we've been able to do that in some situations, absolutely. In other situations, we just haven't been able to do that. And what the enablers have ended up being is a kind of infrastructure swap team, which a few examples where we've fired one of the team into another team for like 3 or 6 sprints or whatever, just to grind through a bunch of Terraform. And it's got the work done, but it hasn't, we haven't left them in a good position to then carry on afterwards. And we haven't, and it gets a bit frustrating for that team as well. So we haven't solved that problem yet. We're working on it, and we'll keep iterating on it, and we'll keep talking about it, and we'll keep having retrospectives. The next big thing that we got, I guess, criticized for a little bit, which was fair enough, was dogfooding. This concept of using your own services. So with a lot of the services that we provide, if you think about our observability tools, like our Elasticsearch clusters, Prometheus, that sort of thing, we use all of that. We use Terraform, we use all of the modules we create. But then there are other things in there, like the continuous delivery pipeline that we built for the component teams. We've never had the time to retrofit that into our own stuff. So if you remember early on, I was talking about making time for automation. We've now ended up in the situation, which we're in the middle of rectifying now, where we don't have the automation we want. to deploy and make changes and maintain these environments. So we've got several customer environments now and several tiers of those environments. So what happens if we make an update to those root modules? Maybe it's adding in permissions, it's fixing some kind of bug, it's adding in a new feature. Up until now, we've had to go in and bump the version manually on each of those repositories, and apply all of the Terraform and check all of that sort of stuff. And we haven't had the tests and that sort of thing in there. And that's basically because of the pace that we ran at when we first started this. We haven't had the time to go back and pay back some of this technical debt. So one of the big problems was this CD module that we created for them was, well, it wasn't. It's a bit finicky, and it's a bit flaky, and we've iterated on it a few times, and we're relatively happy with it now. But there are things in there like the way we do secrets and that sort of stuff that feel very forced and that sort of thing. And because we haven't been using it, people resent that to an extent, because we're saying you need to do this. And if we go back to the idea of a platform being an optional thing, that goes against that sort of principle. But so we've as I say, as we've sort of, it sort of gives you that. It's difficult to demonstrate empathy with your customers if it looks like you're saying, do what I do not as I say, if you know what I mean. So like I say, we're pretty good at this with a lot of our tooling, but stuff like the automation and stuff, it was a trade-off at the time between spending the time on making our own lives easier or just living with it. And spoiler alert, you can't just live with it. There's a threshold at which point it becomes completely unworkable. So we are now in the middle of kind of revisiting that and kind of doing sort of version 2.0 of that, as it were, to sort of bring back automate all of this sort of process and start to bring it into some kind of alignment. So the lessons we've really learned, to sort of summarize these points that I've waffled on about, is the first thing that I think is so important is find some time to reduce toil to do this automation piece. Anything you automate is time freed up for more creative work. And that's important for two reasons. It's important because you're not, anytime you're spent doing manual soul destroying tasks is time you're not spent delivering features or squashing bugs for your customers. It's also just soul destroying to keep having to do the same manual tasks over and over and over again. And if that starts to impact on the things that your customers need, that ultimately starts to impact on the things that your organization's customers need. And that, no one wants to be that guy. If it takes days for you to spin up an environment for your team, it's not a good experience for anybody. It might be unbearably obvious, but during the heat of the sprints to deliver something, and you're sort of 3 or 4 sprints into a thing, and you just need to get it over the line. I find that this and documentation are the first things to just go out the window. It's like, we'll just deal with it for now. Camille Fournier, if you've ever heard of her, she wrote a great book here called The Manager's Path. I suggest you read it if you're interested. It's really good. She suggests always carving out 20% of your time to deal with what she calls sustainability work. So that's this sort of thing. It's squashing tech debt. It's automating things. Now that 20% might be 20% of your sprint points for a particular sprint, or it might be 1 in 5 sprints or something like that. But we've found that that's a good sort of trade-off between delivery and keeping things running. The next thing is eat more dog food. Anything you supply to your customers, try and use it yourself. CD pipelines, processes, services. It's important for empathy. Not saying you can't show empathy without doing this, but it's a really obvious thing to do. And if you don't do it, what we found is that from the customer's point of view, it feels it feels like you aren't showing that kind of empathy, and it feels like there's a kind of us and them thing, and that kind of exacerbates that. It also just means that you'll see the problems and be able to fix them before your users notice, and no amount of tests is ever going to be a substitute for user experience of some of these things. The next thing is adopt product management techniques. A lot of this stuff, again, is kind of zeitgeisty at the moment. State of DevOps reports out this year from Puppet Labs. I noticed a familiar trend from last year, which is a focus on internal platform teams as enablers and force multipliers, as they like to say. This year, it talks a lot about adopting product management techniques, platform teams adopting product management techniques, and treating the platform as an internal product. I've been kind of half-arsing this now for a while, but in the last few weeks, we've started to earnestly define that platform better. One of the criticisms we have from internally from our own team is it's very difficult to define what it is we do. We have kind of fuzzy boundaries. They sometimes feel like they're a catch-all team for stuff people don't want to do. So what we're trying to do is translate that into capabilities that we're trying to enable for our own customers. So building out a bunch of user stories and seeing if we hit those, and looking at all of the bits of technology and services that we do provide and seeing if they fit into these places. And if they do, great. And if they do, how do we improve them? And if they don't, why are we even doing it? We'll throw it out. Identify who your customers are. Know exactly what it is you want to deliver to them, and then try and share a mutual understanding of that. Buy what you don't need to build. The likelihood is your infrastructure needs aren't that unique. Unless you're a cloud vendor, your infrastructure is not going to be the key differentiator between you and your competitors. It's not the unique selling point of your organization. It doesn't mean it's not foundational to your success. It just means that boring solutions are sometimes the best ones. There are still loads of opportunities for infrastructure, for DevOps engineers, to be platform engineers, to be creative without having to try and run a bare metal Elasticsearch cluster. And as someone who's done that, you can see the grey hair. So it sounds like an innocuous sentence: do product management in your platform team. But it's what we found is a really easy thing to say, but a really difficult thing to define. What I do suggest, though, is if you, as this is on the slide, if you just Google the platform as a product, WTF-NRs that Container Solutions put out, there's a series of 2 of them with Matthew Skelton from Team Topologies, and he talks about how you can practically apply these ideas to platform teams, to internal platform teams. That's really helpful. I'd urge anyone to go and look at those. Find a way to do more training. Is another one. This is going to be totally unique to your own organization. If you're a really small startup and you've got 20 people, it's probably really easy. If you're a massive organization with 2,000 devs, it's not going to be easy. Documentation is brilliant. It's a really good reference tool, but unless you've got technical writers available, it's not worth your time to write a very comprehensive narrative guide to your platform. Keep it as a reference. Have enough in there that you can use as a comprehensive reference, and try to automate it as much as possible. We've used a bunch of make doc sites for each discrete chunk of infrastructure that sits in the repo with the code. Every time we make an update, we'll update the docs. It all then gets stitched together into a CI pipeline. There's one thing we did automate into a CI pipeline to a single cohesive site, so people can go there and search, and the search is sort of universal. And then there are things in there like AWS accounts and who uses what, and they all get pulled out from data and written into the make doc site as it gets built. So we don't have to update that stuff manually. I mean, we used to use like a Confluence page, but if someone forgot to go in and put all the account numbers in there, it'd be a nightmare trying to find them out afterwards. They're imperative to what you're doing, docs, don't get me wrong, but training is much better for onboarding. How you do that, like I say, is really going to depend on your organization. But we found a lot of value out of live coding exercises. For example, we did one not recently, but we did one some time ago about where we instrumented someone's component with Prometheus. Just dumped out a whole bunch of the runtime metrics and built a dashboard in Grafana for them. Pushed all that into, built all that into Terraform, and then pushed it into code, and then they've been able to just iterate on that themselves. It's been really helpful for them. But we got a whole bunch of people watching that, and people have then gone off and done their own thing. That was a really good thing to do, and we did that in about an hour. It was sort of an hour session, and we didn't record it. We didn't have recording facilities at the time, but you can record this sort of thing and then have a nice little library of them. Now, it does take time. It takes a hell of a lot of time and effort to do these things, both to prepare the material and to get enough people in the place to deliver it. But actually, things like the coronavirus and everyone working from home and recording things on Zoom or Google Meet or whatever it is you use is kind of free and what we do now. So you don't have to deliver as many of these things. You only have to sort of deliver them once. But yeah, I mean, think about that. Also think about enabling teams. We found that they really do enhance our platform team. They've got the freedom to go and spend 3-5 sprints inside another team, helping them to solve an acute problem, trying their absolute best to leave the capabilities behind. We've had mixed results. It's been difficult, but overwhelmingly the feedback we've had from every single engagement has been massively positive. Even if we didn't do what we set out to do, they've appreciated, and it's helped us to reinforce our relationship with them. And then shift left, but not too left. You've got to really think about what capabilities are inside those teams before you start on this one. You can't just start throwing stuff over the fence and not think about whether it's going to land. We are very clear as an organization that our component teams, our product teams, essentially develop, own, and run their products very much in the traditional DevOps sense. In order to do that, though, you need cross-functional teams, and we haven't got that with all of them. So there are exceptions to this. They do their best, but they need help sometimes. Now, we're clear about that as an organization. If that's ambiguous in your organization, then you might struggle with this. But when you adopt this approach, the product that you're talking about, the component you're talking about, it's no longer just the code, right? It's code, it's config, it's environment, it's deployment, it's the monitoring, it's the logging, it's all the little operations bits. Think deeply, though, about what people need to know to do what they need to do. Do they have to understand how things hang together in a Kubernetes cluster? Yeah, they do. They need to know the services. They need to know where deployment is. They might need to know what a stateful set is. Who knows? They need to know a bit about storage and that sort of stuff. But do they need to know about, the stuff under the hood, about how we configure Calico and how we do core DNS? No, absolutely not. It might be a gray area. It's definitely going to differ in your organization. So do the work to go and ask them and find out. I can get into my car and drive to Sainsbury's without knowing how to replace an oil filter, because I know I can take my car to a mechanic who will do it for me. It doesn't change my ability to go and get last minute snacks for the Lions match on Saturday, but it's there if I need it. So that's a sort of advice on that. Shift as far left as you can. Keep pushing it, absolutely, but iterate. So in conclusion, we sort of we started to really look about how to do DevOps at scale. We, like I imagine a lot of people, concentrated a bit too much on process and tools and the engineering problems, because at the end of the day, we're all engineers. The real value, though, is in the relationship and the interactions with the other teams. Knowing what kinds of team archetype you have from team topologies is a good way of seeing what kind of interactions work well. It can't tell you everything. It's not the be-all and end-all. At the end of the day, it's just advice, and it's very generic advice. It can't magically fix your culture, but it can make you start to think about things a little bit more critically. As a platform team, it's really easy to hide behind this X as a service interface and accidentally become siloed. Just raise a ticket. That's kind of what we've been doing to an extent. But make sure you set up these feedback mechanisms. Make sure you keep talking to each other and never assume that you know what's best. Honestly, if your budget allows it, get a product manager in there. Get someone who understands how to do product management and ask the right questions in there, because I'm rubbish at it. I've been lucky enough to have a product manager, but get one in there. You may think that you can do all of these disciplines with the people that are in your team, but I don't think you can. I've never seen evidence that you really can. Get someone in there that really understands product management and help you develop it as a product. And that's sort of my big a big conclusion from all of this. And we're still in the process of doing this, so we're still on that journey. And finally, we're hiring. The Linux Recruit guys have shared a microsite, but you can also go to our page and click on the careers button. We're looking for these things. So software development engineers and test, cloud native software engineers, some software engineers that are doing stuff with the sensors, product designers, ADAS systems, front-end engineers. We've got loads of them. Yeah, so that's it.